Shalom, everyone. This is very exciting. I'm in Addis Kodesh MS new home. This is the first sermon I'm recording here. Emir to Hashem, hopefully in the not too distant future, as things seem to get better, we'll actually be able to have in-person services here. But I'm very excited to be here, and it's something for us to all look forward to. Today's sermon is the Meron tragedy, a theological response. Behar Bechukotai 5781. Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, still stood at Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. However, our thoughts turn to another mountain, Har Meron. Last week on Lag BaOmer, Israel experienced its worst peacetime tragedy ever. 90,000 people went to celebrate the yahrzeit of Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a well-known mystical rabbi who lived around the time of Rabbi Akiva, around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Every Lag BaOmer, huge amounts of people flocked to his kever, to his grave, to honor him on his yahrzeit on the day of his death. However, as we know, tragedy ensued. In the crowded bleachers, people slipped, and next thing you know, there was a domino effect. People are falling all over each other. There was a stampede which left 45 people dead and over 150 people wounded. Celebration turned into tragedy. It's nothing worse than when you come to celebrate and you wind up leaving as a mourner. Though there's plenty of finger pointing as to who's to blame for this tragedy, at least people, by and large, are not saying that this was some sort of divine retribution. And I was concerned about that, because you can certainly see somebody saying, this is divine retribution against the Haredi community for not observing the coronavirus regulations. Now, we shouldn't paint with an overly broadly brush. It's not the entire Haredi ultra-Orthodox community or the entire observant community. However, we know there's been issues and segments of these communities in which the following of these guidelines has not been particularly impressive. And I was concerned that people might say, this is divine retribution because the community failed to prioritize the mitzvah of pekuach nefesh, safeguarding life. We're told not to gather in large crowds, and unfortunately, that did not always happen, particularly in some of these more observant communities. I was particularly concerned people would say this was divine retribution because human nature is we want to make sense of events. Moshe Rabbeinu, even Moses, the greatest prophet ever, greatest Navi ever, fell into this trap. After Aharon, or Aaron's two sons, died, Moshe said to Aharon, the reason they died is because, as God said, V'krovai akadesh, I will be sanctified by those who are nearest to me. What Moshe was saying to Aharon, who was looking at his two dead sons right before him, was that God has taken them on human sacrifice. God has taken them as human sacrifices. We just inaugurated this Mishkan, this tabernacle, and they were God's sacrificial lambs, so to speak. What was Aharon's response? There was no response. Vayidom Aharon. And Aharon was silent. He didn't know what to say. Moshe's response was so ridiculous. He didn't know what to say. How could it be that Moshe, the greatest prophet, missed the very meaning of Akedat Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, in which we're taught that God does not want human sacrifices. He doesn't want us to provide him with human sacrifices. He doesn't want to take people as human sacrifices. Yes, Moshe was attempting to comfort his brother in a moment of agony. His intentions were pure, they were good. However, his words caused pain, which we can see in Aharon's silence. Why did Moshe make the mistake? Despite the fact that he's the greatest prophet ever, he's human, and he too was attempting to make sense of a tragedy. I remember after Anne, my wife, miscarried, someone sent her literature, articles about how one comforts a woman who's miscarried or a couple who's experienced a miscarriage. And there were some nice articles. One of the articles was written by a rabbi, and he explained that the reason why a woman miscarries is because the neshama, the soul of the baby, which is to be born, which has not yet been born, is so pure, it can't stand to be in this world polluted by sin and impurities. So therefore, God immediately takes the neshama, the soul, back up to heaven. Now, the rabbi who wrote the piece was really trying to comfort people. I give him credit for that. It's a difficult situation. He was trying to comfort people. However, this attempt was of no comfort to us. It actually caused us pain. It sounded ridiculous. God allows you to be pregnant, but then says, the baby is too holy for this world. I'm going to take the neshama, the soul, back up to heaven. It seems cruel to the expecting parents. But yet people come up with these type of suggestions to try to explain the inexplainable because, frankly, they're reluctant to blame God. After all, we're taught at a very young age, God is all-powerful, he's kind, and he's just. So therefore, when something goes wrong, there must be a reason, and we can't blame God. So inadvertently, what happens is people sometimes blame the victim. Remember, a very prominent rabbi in Israel, I won't mention his name, even fell into this trap. He was asked why people suffer during the Shoah, the Holocaust. And he wound up explaining it was because of sins they committed in their past lives. This was based on the idea of Gilgul Neshama, reincarnation, which is a Kabbalistic type of idea. What a cruel thing to say. You suffered because of sins you committed in your past life? Blaming the victim. After the tsunami in 2004 in Eastern Asia, people said that it was caused because people living there weren't obeying the 7 Noahide laws, which, as far as Jews are concerned, apply to all humanity. Again, blaming the victim. Not only are you blaming the victim, you're already helping to grow a seed that's already been planted in the victim's head. When people suffer, they too are looking for reasons and try to make sense of why they're suffering. It's not enough for them to simply say, I'm suffering. Who knows why God allows these things to happen? And often they wind up blaming themselves. Think about victims of abuse, often wind up blaming themselves. They shouldn't, and intellectually, rationally, they very well may realize it, but it's hard not to. The emotion, that need to figure out why, simply overpowers. This was also demonstrated very well in a very fine Israeli film called The Women's Balcony. There was a women's balcony in an Orthodox shul, and during a bar mitzvah, it collapsed. The rabbi's wife wound up in a coma, people were injured, and the elderly rabbi could no longer function as the rabbi of the shul. The shul was suddenly in disarray, and a young rabbi comes in and he starts taking charge of the shul. He's starting to organize minyanim, everything is coming back, it's wonderful. But then he addresses the issue of why. Why did this tragedy take place? And he blames the women for not properly covering their heads. The women who are listening to this are repulsed. He's blaming us. The reason why our balcony fell is because we weren't properly covering our heads. But then one of the women said, even though I was repulsed, I was turned off, I was disgusted by what I was hearing, I couldn't help but listen. I was drawn in by what he was saying. Why would she be drawn in by what he's saying? He's blaming her for this horrendous tragedy. She was drawn in because he's providing an answer. He was answering the question of why. The problem is, not only is it cruel to blame the victim, it's not theologically correct. Let's go back to Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. As God and Bnei Yisrael are making up for the sin of the egel, the golden calf, Moshe says to God, Vayoma hareina et kavodeha. God, show me, please, your glory. This is understood to mean that Moshe wants God to explain to him why he allows things to happen. That's how the rabbis understand, show me your glory. Moshe is saying, show me your logic as to why you allow things to happen. Moshe already speaks to God, panim el panim, face to face, but that's not enough. Now he really wants to see what's going on behind the scenes. But God says to Moshe, I will place you in a cleft in the rock and pass by you, and afterwards you will only see my back. What is God saying to Moshe? You can't see my face. In other words, you can't see divine logic. You could only see my logic from an obstructed view. And since it's an obstructed view, you're not going to always be able to make full sense of what's going on. It's like seeing a ball game or a Broadway show from an obstructed point of view. You're going to miss things, and it may really skew the way you're understanding things. That's God's way of saying to Moshe, the person who came closest to God, that even he was not going to be able to understand. So certainly we're not going to be able to fully understand divine logic as to why God allows things to happen. This is similar to Plato's allegory in the cave. It's a famous allegory, you may remember it from political science classes in college. People are chained to a wall in a cave their entire lives, and they're facing a blank wall, and the people are watching shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them. And they eventually give the shadows names, and the shadows become the prisoner's reality, except they're not accurate. They're simply representations of the world. They're simply seeing the shadows on the wall, not what's really going on. God is telling Moshe the same thing. You can't see my reality, my truth, just as those prisoners of Plato's cave can't see what's really going on. At best, they're getting an obstructed view. The message is we're not going to understand fully, and we're going to have to be content with that. However, we should note that in Bechukotai, which we also read this week, there is a cause and effect. God tells us, if you sin, you will suffer in a certain fashion. Tit for tat. The difference is here, God is explicitly telling us that if you do this, I'm going to cause this to happen to you. That's God's job. That's not our job. God can tell us why we're suffering, but it's not up to us to go over to our fellow and say, you are suffering because you've aggravated God or failed to carry out God's word correctly. Later on in the Tanakh, this message is again reiterated. Same theme as Moshe speaking to God, but this time it's Job, and he's lost his family and his fortune. He's miserable, poor guy. His friends come over and they basically sit shiva with him. They hold his hand, they're consoling him, they're very nice. But then afterwards, they say, Job, God is righteous, he's powerful, he's kind, he's just, yet he allowed you to suffer. Why? You must have done something to bring the suffering upon yourself. It's your fault. And of course, he becomes furious with his friends. Not only that, he challenges God. He says to God, God, why have I suffered? What have I done to you? that you have allowed me, that you've caused me to suffer. And God answers, gives him a similar answer to that, which at least is implied when he speaks to Moshe. Certain things which are simply beyond human understanding, you leave it to God. That's God's message. In times of tragedy, let's do what Job's friends initially did at the beginning. That's the right response. You go, you hold your friend's hand, you let them know that you're there. And the beauty is you don't have to say anything. You don't have to come up with some sort of pithy rationale for why God allows things to happen. You don't even have to say a word. In fact, when you go into a shiva house, the halacha is you don't say a word until the mourner speaks to you. They will speak first and they'll let you know when they're ready to speak. Takes you off the hook. No explanations. Just be there and let them know that their friends are there to support. Think of it this way. We have the right to remain silent. It's like the Miranda law. You don't have to say anything, but you do have to show up and comfort. So let me conclude by simply saying, it's not our job to explain or know why tragedies happen. All we have to do is show up and comfort. Shabbat Shalom.